Hello. It's really nice to be back at the MK Gallery. Thanks to Outlands and the Joyous Thing and everyone, Sam in particular, for asking me to come and do this. So a couple of housekeeping things. I timed myself reading this and it came in at about half an hour due to my undynamic, not very good reading style. It will seem like it's going on a lot longer to you lot. I'm going to try and keep it short, but I think what I'm trying to say is at the end, there should be room for maybe one or two questions. And normally, when I'm doing these kind of talks, I usually remind people in the audience that the Q in Q&A stands for question, not long, rambling, drunken monologue. I've stopped doing that now because there was nearly a fight at a fall thing that I did it a few weeks ago. But if you want to ask a question, please do. If we don't have time, we're going to go straight over to the lovely buffet over the road. If you do have a burning question or you want to slag me off or anything like that, please feel free just to approach me at the buffet and talk to me then. So 3 years ago, I invented a spurious musical movement called New Weird Britain. I totally made it up. It doesn't exist, not really anyway. It took me the exact time to name it that it took me to write the words down, New, Weird, and Britain. And before I made this genre up, I'd always thought of people who made up musical genres when they don't really exist, like, I don't know, Shroomadelica, New Grave, whatever, as being particularly pathetic people. So I wanted to explain how I ended up at this kind of weird juncture. Acting as the editor of the online culture magazine, The Quietus, I commissioned a new column from the fantastic Cardiff-based music journalist Noel Gardner in 2017, simply because he's one of my favourite writers, and the idea of making him write a column about the stranger edges of the UK DIY music scene called Noel's Foul House really cracked me up. I'd employed him a few years earlier to do a column on hardcore punk, purely so I could publish him under the title of Noel's Straight Hedge. And all of this music that was featured in this column didn't really sound like each other. Like, none of these bands really had that much in common. But I felt like I needed a snappy catch-all title to kind of lasso all this music together. And I'd just been reading an article in The Wire about the New Weird America movement, which was invented by the rakish and fine-smelling wordsmith David Keenan in 2003, where he talked about the ramshackle backwater psychedelic groups such as No Neck Blues Band and Sunburnt Hand of the Man. And I just thought, I'll have that. So in 2017, I remember thinking to myself, yeah, I'll call this made-up genre New Weird Britain. It's not brilliant, but it'll all be forgotten about by Christmas. And it's not like I'm going to be given a 4-part Radio 4 series and in 3 years' time find myself in a lecture room in Milton Keynes having to explain what I was talking about. But one thing, as is though one, led to another, and here we are. So over the 3 years after I named it, New Weird Britain, the non-existent New Weird Britain, got featured in Vice, Loud and Quiet, on Noisy. It's been discussed in several countries in panel format. And it's had stages dedicated to it at festivals. And I think probably about 10 million people heard the radio series on it. Now, by inventing this thing, I did actually have one noble intention. Now, I've often found the obstacle to true communication, the noise to signal radio and the internet, it's really frustrating. So the stuff I might feel passionate about, let's say, for example, the wonderful Basingstoke via Tottenham band Sly and the Family Drone might be playing with a show with kind of avant-garde doom metal jazz improv band dead Neanderthals. And that to me might seem like a really big deal, but I would struggle really to get people to pay attention if I wanted to write about it. But if I sat down and kind of tossed off a think piece tomorrow comparing Kanye West to Oliver Cromwell or whoever, like it would spread across the internet like wildfire. So my hypothesis was that it would be easier to cut through the noise to digital publishing marketplace if I invented a narrative framework when discussing DIY music. And I guess that much seems to be true. New Weird Britain has given me the largest audience I've ever had for anything I've ever done. And we're talking about nothing to do with Kanye West, but bands like Gutter Snipe and Lone Taxidermist, who are kind of make difficult art by anyone's standards. But by being forced to justify my actions to an audience of millions of people, essentially and mainly by my amazing co-conspirator, Alana Chance of Late Junction and Reduced Listening, she propelled me somewhat shamefacedly on a revelatory journey. And not only did it become clear that music was going through something of a sea change in structural terms, but that the deep structures of culture itself were warping out of all recognition. And this was in direct relationship to the violently changing times we find ourselves in. Now, without wanting to state the obvious, we are living through quite awful times. We're like only a plague of locusts away from a full-blown Old Testament shit show. And as a music writer, I'm often asked to appear on radio or TV to provide a neat 90-second soundbite about how bad times make for good music. And it's a request I always decline, because it would take me the full minute and a half alone just to point out why it's a flawed proposition. I'm not saying it's totally wrong per se. I'm like, bad times can make for good art, but it's not a given, as there are as many examples of good times creating good art I could mention. For every punk, you've got like a drum and bass or a glam rock. And if you allow me to make a slight adjustment to the shibboleth, then the way that I see things is this: weird times tend to inculcate weird culture. And I would bear this in mind next time you see some confused golden ager, boomer, opinion writer, or bitter Generation X mouthpiece asking, where are all the songs of protest? They're wrong for two equally important reasons. Now, the first is they're almost certainly ignorant of where the genuine protest music of 2020 can be found. And that's probably in drill, grime, SoundCloud rap, and very commercially available pop music. But also, two, they're missing the point and asking the wrong question anyway. Just because the violently changing times we live in aren't producing traditional protest music in the kind of pop, folk, punk, indie idiom that's hitting home with a university-educated, middle-class, mainly white mainstream audience in the same way that it probably did in 1968, it's a logical fallacy to assume that the fucking appalling times we find ourselves in at the moment isn't having an effect on culture full stop. Modern musicians tend not to be so obvious or didactic. The distress caused by a rapidly changing society is often mirrored in music's form and process rather than its content or message. Now, this is just my opinion, but, you can feel free to fight me over it later. The cultural changes happening now are weird in structural terms as much as anything else. This deep shift is caused by a perfect storm of things happening right now. This includes the collapse of state funding for the arts. And let's stop here for a second and just remind ourselves, if we're going to turn around and say, well, there's still arts funding, you can still get it. How many people in this room have in the past or are planning on applying for ACE funding? I'm guessing it's quite a lot of us. I know I have. And how do we feel about Elizabeth Murdoch being on the board of governors? I mean, what does that say? Is this the first movement in a kind of like a corporate takeover? It's what it feels like to me anyway. But it's not just that. There's the partial financial failure of the old music industry. Instead of the never-ending collapse at the periphery dampening down creativity, though, it's actually emboldening it. There's the rapid changing political climate of today and the rise of nationalism, which I'll come back to in a second. When it comes to the means of cultural production, there's the much vaunted fully democratizing effect of the internet has finally arrived in low-income households after a long lag. There's the death of the hip metropolitan city centre as a valid option for young creative people, without independent means, that is. The resulting formation of new artistic communities in unexpected locations. Generational shift from millennial to Gen Z or meta-modern. The overwhelming gravitational pull of the Spotify algorithm on modern pop production, creating acres of space for everyone else who doesn't sign up to it. There's the idea also that the retromania philosophy of a decade ago was perhaps itself something of a critical fad, touted by those who were too used to viewing the progress of culture through the narrow twin prisms of post-punk and acid house. And there's the anxiety generated by the idea that the social and political systems we once took to be as immutable as the mountains now look a little bit shaky. So weird times equal weird music. And it's my philosophy that it would be really weird if they didn't. But above and beyond the idea of culture becoming warped by the rapidly changing times we find ourselves in, my theory is that it's merely culture starting to return to its natural state, that of plasticity, unpredictability, and utter bizarreness. The way we perceive the world itself via conflicting news sources and digital platforms tailored to our individual beliefs has uncovered a gulf between how we experience reality and how others do. And when the fabric of reality itself begins to break down, why should we expect culture to maintain its integrity or conformity? Using culture to try and maintain the illusion of permanence, that we're on some kind of plateau, like a baton of kind of classic music and classic art and classic style and classic writing gets handed on from one generation to the next, is bullshit. And it's being exposed as stuff, or we will begin to be exposed as stuff. Pretending that everything is carrying on as normal when everything is clearly in violent flux is a fool's errand, and slightly creepy as well, actually, I think. So once you start noticing this stuff, it's hard to ignore. But, you know, the ideas, some of these ideas that I'm talking about, by the way, they're not new at all. When describing the nightmarish dystopias of the future, both George Orwell and Evgeny Zamyatin had the common sense to realize that all forms of culture would be used to oppress the people. So 1984 contains the idea of the versificator, and Zamyatin's We, which is like a hugely influential Russian novel that 1984 lent quite heavily on, described the idea of the music cometa. Both of these things are music programs which churn out formulaic music to all citizens. But like this is an auto-generative hellscape that's already kind of arrived. AI software has been produced which proudly brags that it can produce pop songs, symphonies and ambient music at the touch of a few buttons. And the rigid algorithms all but control the giant streaming services. For new songs to thrive on the monolith Spotify, they have to conform to a rigid pattern. Chorus first, big hooks, vocal chops, no long intros, everything hyper-compressed. Sorry, Sly and the Family Drone and the Dead Neanderthals' new split EP. No Spotify playlist for you. And it's already all but destroyed the spontaneity and artfulness of most current pop music. The incredible and inescapable gravity of the Spotify playlist algorithm is sucking most current mainstream music into a hyper-dense center where little space for genuine diversity remains, and much new music appears to be a potential copyright nightmare because of it. So everything sounds like an echo of something we've already heard. And just as an aside, this isn't a general broadside against either algorithms or AI, it's what they're used for. Two of my favourite albums from last year would include Holly Herndon's Proto and Jennifer Walsh's All the Many Peoples, but they were using AI, for example, in an extremely creative manner. So playlist algorithms, which is what I'm specifically talking about, draw you towards the conservative centre like a tractor beam because they don't exist for any other purpose. It's their job and it's what they're incredibly efficient at. There were 46 billion songs streamed in the UK in 2016, but fewer new songs made it into the top 10 than in previous years. Only 11 songs made it to number 1 compared to 24 the year before that and 38 the year before that. So the big hits are getting bigger, and everything else is falling away. And this is really, really great if you are the group of people who've written the Old Town Road, but it's terrible if you're anyone else. For all of those who opt out of the algorithmically controlled financial mainstream, this has opened up acres of barely occupied space in relative terms. Now, by way of another digression, I really need to point out here that I don't think it's a good thing that DIY musicians can, in most cases, no longer even cover the costs of what they do when they perform live. As someone who has to work a second job just so he can afford the luxury of running an independent magazine about an underground culture, I actually sympathise really deeply. But we are where we are, and I'm actually tonight and this weekend more interested in looking at the pros of this situation that we find ourselves in rather than the cons. In a very obvious way, the people who make weird culture, many of them in this room or connected to Outlands in one way or another, are operating what seems to me a natural, authentic way. And it's worth bearing in mind the way culture actually functions is extremely weird. When you read a book, you're staring at a linear string of symbols until you hallucinate an entirely new universe, which you then travel through or float above like a demiurge. When you watch a film, you are performing an analogue of dynamic travel in time and space until you become part of a shared vision that defies any kind of spatial or temporal logic. Craziest of all, when you listen to music, your brain interprets a series of vibrations in the air as a thrilling hyperdimensional pattern, partially constructed from abstract thought, triggering intricate strings of heightened emotional flashes. There's a summoning of ghosts, an augury of future hope, and even a tangible glimpse of the numinous. It can prime you for war, it can prime you for sex, and that all sounds pretty fucking weird to me. Who are these people asking for normal, straightforward, unpretentious music? What is that? I don't think it really exists. On a day-to-day basis, you probably don't do anything weirder than engaging with new culture. It's our truest chance to experience literal magic, astral projection, necromancy, metempsychosis, and time travel. The natural state of culture is weird because we are weird people, weird creatures. The idea that culture should be normal and unpretentious is pathologically existential squeamishness. And by the way, if you've just wandered in to watch Body Vice and Godspeed You, Peter Andre, and you've got no idea what I'm going on about and you kind of wish I'd stop or whatever, well, sorry, I'm not about to. I've got another 10 or 15 minutes left yet. But I will just explain what I'm talking about by this kind of New Weird Britain thing. Even though it doesn't exist, like I've already said. So I'm talking about a genre, but it didn't happen along traditional genre lines. I'm actually talking about musicians who are completely disentangled from the mainstream music industry, who have been liberated rather than crushed by its collapse. They're making unclassifiable music, putting on unrepeatable cross-disciplinary shows in non-standard venues, mixing music with film, contemporary dance, outlandish costumes, performance art, and other non-standard elements to what they do. The emphasis is on the live event because it doesn't allow for commodification and it encourages direct participation by the audience. Excitingly, it tends to be more female-led than the kind of traditional areas of like rock music. And And it exists not only outside of the traditional rock circuit, but outside of the normal arts circuit as well. Not to mention way outside the usual hip metropolitan city centres. It tends to be outside of the academy, the university, and divorced from serious funding. It's definitely working class or lower middle class, or precariat, I guess. And of course, it seems to be a safe space for LGBTQ plus performers, and also those coming to terms with kind of like access issues or mental health and addiction issues. Now, it has its own mycelium network of smaller, more radical, sometimes provincial festivals: Supernormal, Supersonic, Thought Process, Fat Out, Woodland Gathering, Weird Wild West. There's loads of them. And it thrives in important but regionally scattered hubs such as Green Door in Glasgow, New River Studio in Tottenham, White Hotel in Salford, and let us add the name of Outlands and MK Gallery to that glorious but incomplete list. Now, some people, understandably, didn't really like my idea about New Weird Britain. Fair play to them. I feel I should say this just to, because it is important. I chose the name in a rush, and if I had a time machine, I would suggest politely to myself to call it something different. But I'm not joking when I said I just kind of pulled this name out of a hat. I didn't think I was going to do anything with it. It kind of snowballed without my say-so. So the term weird has caused a few people some consternation due to its clear connection with the noun weirdo. Now, I have sincere concerns about this. I know some people have been called weirdo due to their race or sexual orientation, for example. Now, I cannot and will not question their lived experience. All I'll offer in terms of my privilege as a straight white man using this term is to say that as a 13-year-old, I was beaten in an assault over the way I looked, I guess, that left me partially sighted and with life-changing PTSD and a raft of other kind of things that came along with that, like alcoholism. Now, I use the word weird, but I don't think about that incident because, to me, weird and weirdo have significantly different etymological meanings, and they mean different things. So I'm really, really sorry if you find the term offensive. It wasn't my intention to offend you anyway, and I'm just trying to explain why I'm using the term weird. I'm going to go a bit further in a second, if anyone's still left in the room, over what the history of the word weird is, and I think it's worth sticking around for that bit, just because what I'm ultimately interested in is everyone reclaiming the true meaning of the word weird. Now, another criticism of the term, which I'm less concerned about, is a dislike of the word new. When I came up with the term, I was not, funnily enough, saying that DIY music had only been invented 3 years ago, merely that it was going through a significant and radical shift, and a very exciting significant and radical shift. So to sum up again, the kinds of acts were once othered, often by being termed outsider, but now there were so many of them that they couldn't be treated as an anomaly. You couldn't have like a totally normal indie lineup for 3 days and then just stick Paddy Steer on at the end and say, oh, we've ticked the outsider box. You know, I was going to festivals like Supersonic and Supernormal, and everyone would make Paddy Steer look like just some guy you'd see down Wetherspoons or whatever, you know. So things were changing, I felt. During the Manchester section of the New Weird Britain series for Radio 4, I made the point that in the 90s and noughties, Manchester was more commonly perceived to be the birthplace of the Smiths, New Order, and Oasis than the home of radical art, and it had been in danger of becoming known internationally just as a heritage-first city rather than a nexus of innovation, but that nowadays the city was clearly once again putting DIY weirdness first. After it broadcast, I stumbled across 2 Facebook posts, which bear repeating here simply because they cracked me up at the time. The first was made by a disgruntled chap in Manchester who said, "So John Doran has just discovered DIY music in Manchester. It's a shame he wasn't at the basement of Gilly's Rock World on August 17th, 1998, when Ballsack played their now legendary game-changing improv power electronics set." Yeah, it's an absolute crying shame I wasn't at that gig, mate. I can't even imagine how good Ballsack must have been in 1998. And another following on from that, there was a comment which said, "It seems like John Doran has never heard of The Fall." You know, I sometimes wish I'd never heard of The Fall. I have flights of fantasy where I'm actually a successful IT consultant who has never even heard of Hex Induction Hour and is certainly not a mentally ravaged writer who has been successfully and totally crushed by life, yet somehow has still found time to buy 8 different copies of that fucking album. I wasn't saying, I mean, like, I know it suggests the word new in New Weird Britain suggests that it's never been done before, but that's not really how it works. When it comes to the idea of newness, we need to concentrate on optics and strike a balance between acknowledging that there's nothing truly new under the sun, but that there are some things which are much newer than all the rest, and these are often the things that deserve our attention and support. I think for me, now in 2020, New Weird Britain, the thought experiment and non-existent genres served its purpose. My website, The Quietus, will always support DIY culture, both from Britain and internationally, and I will as well, but I'm now more interested in thinking generally about weirdness in contemporary culture, and it's something I'm writing a book about, which will hopefully be out next year. The research has thrown up some very interesting ideas. I now use the word weird while reflecting on all of its etymological staging posts and its many effects. In the 14th century, the Proto-Germanic word words gave us the Old English word weird, which is spelled W-Y-R-D, which literally means that which is yet to come, giving us the sense that weird art deals with precognition and psychic ability rather than just reflection. Now, out of all of the literary works of the last 100 years to dig into the concept of the weird, the one that really resonates for me at the moment is D.M. Thomas's The White Hotel, which was first published in 1981. It was shortlisted for the Booker Prize and lost out to a slightly inferior Midnight's Children by Salman Rushdie, but it still remains in print, and it's something of a modern cult classic, I guess. Now, on the surface, it seems to concern itself with all the possible etymological modes of weirdness. It smashes apart time and space in achieving this. It's undoubtedly formally a work of surreal art because it brings together things that don't belong together into a berserk and bewildering new union. Now, one of its main characters is Sigmund Freud. And by using Sigmund Freud as a character, it's acknowledging the subconscious as the powerhouse of the surreal, the ever-flowing fountainhead of the weird. Freud is treating an opera singer called Anna for the symptoms of erotic hysteria, and he naturally looks to her past for the source of the trauma. However, peeling back the layers of the idea of the weird, we eventually arrive at the WYRD, the state of foreknowledge of what is yet to come. Anna's symptoms have nothing to do with her childhood and foreshadow an event yet to happen, her death at the massacre of Babi Yar in 1940. Sorry about that spoiler if you haven't read the book, by the way. I've sort of ruined it for you now. The White Hotel also happens to be the name of Salford's latest dingy art space on the periphery of the hustle and bustle of Manchester City Centre, where I'm guessing the most provocative forward-thinking, some of the most provocative forward-thinking and having it parties in the Northwest are being thrown. And the White Hotel kind of, in terms of music alone, stepped into the breach of like My Happy Place, which is Islington Mill, which, you know, shamefully ended up a partial victim of its own success. You know, an absolutely beautiful utopian space, but because it inadvertently became the kind of pilot fish for like gentrification, and as always, these idiots who move into areas bring with them noise complaints. And I'm very, very pleased to hear that just last week, Islington Mill has secured enough funding to fix its roof, and hopefully it'll be a home to visual artists for many generations to come. Very much a bunch of fellow travellers. But, yeah. So in the same way that D.M. Thomas's novel is haunted by a spectre of psychotherapy or the work of Sigmund Freud, the White Hotel venue in Salford is haunted by the spectre of capitalist realism or the works of Mark Fisher. Now, according to Mark Fisher, there's a very well-vaunted idea. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than an end to capitalism. which has been attributed to Jameson and Zizek. But this pretty much gives you the essence of what he means by capitalist realism. But in 2020, the weird exists to create zones in which alternatives to capitalism can be dreamt up, while simultaneously being the canary in the cage, warning us of things yet to happen. Now, you might not automatically think of Salford as being a hotbed of psychic or occult activity, but they are, and it is, I mean. And for my sins, I have heard of The Fall. They're actually my favourite group, right? And that's why I have to be careful about what I say next. The Fall are admittedly only spiritually a Salford group. They're actually formed in Prestwich, which is like 3 miles away from Salford. But I think my point remains. Mark Edward Smith was born in Broughton in Salford, and he initially found gainful employment as a shipping clerk on Salford docks. Most post-punk bands were probably kind of Marxist, but what's weird about The Fall is they were more like magicians, really. And because everything about The Fall was so cryptic, it's easy for people to ignore this aspect if they choose not to. But no matter how down to earth The Fall were, they're kind of fundamentally informed, at least in their first third, by magical practice, the occult and weird literature. The Fall's work is haunted by hauntings. A ghost in my house, spectre versus rector, a figure walks, my new house, impression of J Temperance, Jawbone and the air rifle, and on and on and on. And the fact that their best LP, Hex Induction Hour, is literally a ritual magic spell designed to run an end of bad luck. And there is also the not that often discussed fact that Marky Smith saw himself as having weird or psychic abilities. I used to be psychic, he was once fond of saying during interviews, but I drank my way out of it. But it's there, written across the first half of the band's career. Psychic Dancehall provides early clues, and it reaches a kind of a plateau with 2 strange incidents in which Smith apparently has a psychic vision of both the kidnapping of Terry Waite in 1987 and the 1996 IRA bomb in Corporation Street. Now, the Fall's peers, Joy Division, were perhaps more precursors than Precog, but they bear mentioning here as well in this idea of like weirdness. Perhaps one of the most surprising things to happen in the last 4 decades of Western musical history is the length and ubiquity of the 21st century Joy Division revival. Again, apologies to pedants. I know half of them came from Macclesfield, but spiritually they're a Salford band. 40 years on, they had like, what do they have? They've got like 1 floor filler, like 3 songs that you're going to hear outside of your own home, and 2 short albums, and not even enough singles to fill up a convincing best of. Yet 40 years on, they've achieved the kind of permanence that very few bands can even pretend to, let alone achieve. And to understand why, you have to look at the duality of cultural impulses brought to bear on this group's aesthetic. Their outlook and lyrics were as much informed by an obsession with the horrors of World War II as they were by smart speculative fiction written by the likes of William Burroughs and J.G. Ballard. Now, as World War II approaches ceasing to exist as something that anyone actually alive can remember, the band's stark modernism and brutalist futurism has taken primacy in their aesthetic. They created a soundtrack for an imaginary dystopia, one which is slowly and darkly effloresced as we have drifted into it. Put simply, Joy Division actually make more sense today than they did in 1980. Their chilly euphoria, their crawling horror, their cosmic bleakness, their radical anhedonia, they're no longer the recherché affectations of arty post-punks. This is now the sound of the diagnosis of a generation. I think like somehow Joy Division successfully read the room 40 years in advance, and they're as modern as Lil Peep or Post Malone. So in his book, Ghosts of My Life, Mark Fisher wrote eloquently about the ongoing and seemingly unstoppable, never-ending Joy Division revival. If Joy Division matter now more than ever, it's because they capture the depressed spirit of our times. Listen to Joy Division now and you have the inescapable impression that the group were catatonically channeling our present, their future. So the current Joy Division revival has become a bona fide cultural phenomenon, and only some of this is to do with the copyright-free mimetic properties of the Unknown Pleasures t-shirt. So perhaps I'm predisposed to see art associated with Salford as being inadvertently psychic. And just as D.M. Thomas's novel is haunted by terrible and important things yet to happen, I really want to examine the idea that the radical events staged at the White Hotel venue in Salford are not simply a reaction to the rapidly changing news of 2020, but an amplification point of sensitivity to the awful things that are coming our way. Now, I was all set to go up to Salford this month to do a feature on the White Hotel, but one of the organisers, Austin Collins, told me I couldn't come because the venue was shutting for the time being due to unforeseen circumstances, which kind of reminded me that while venues are important and everyone should be doing their utmost to support them, really it's the artists themselves who are the wellspring of weird culture. And that weird culture will prevail no matter what happens with venues and funding. And I think the true spirit of weirdness, if we're talking about Salford, can be found in an artist such as Aya, formerly known as Loft, rather than any brick and mortar venue. Now, before I finish, I just wanted to look one more time at the word weird. It's been through many changes, and the more I look into it, the more I find these really weird, odd, juicy resonances. The word weird, spelt W-Y-R-D, when it first came over into English, as well as meaning like, you know, a spirit who could see the future, it literally meant warp and doom. So I'm sort of like slowly building this continuum in my head of weird music that not only contains Gutter Snipe, Aya and Richard Dawson and psychic post-punk from the late 70s, but also raved up IDM and doom metal made by Electric Wizard or whatever as well. The sense of the uncanny or supernatural that the word took on in the late Middle Ages comes from, like the word weird, meaning odd-looking or odd-behaving, is like came about by accident. Really, it's because the weird sisters in Macbeth were made to look macabre in stage adaptations of Shakespeare's play. It's not what the word means. It doesn't like, oh, someone's weird. It's a weirdness is an internal thing, not how someone dresses or how they look. But these old resonances remain strong, and that, you know, we get that through the idea of things like weird fiction written by the H.P. Lovecraft, William Hope Hodgson, M.R. James, Arthur Machen. Just to go back one last time to The Fall, I know I'm sort of obsessed, I can't stop talking about them, but if we go back to the Joy Division in The Fall, if you watch some like terrible documentary, there's probably one on BBC 4 right now as we speak, and it's talking about The Fall and Joy Division in relation to a Sex Pistols gig, and it'll have some kind of stock footage of bin bags on the corner of some street in Liverpool or something. And I don't think that Sex Pistols gig was important at all. I think like it's downplaying the intelligence and the creative of people from the Northwest, actually. You know, Manchester was a tinderbox ready to go off, and the Sex Pistols just happened to be the first big, exciting band passing through town in the middle of 1976. I think what's more important when it comes to these two bands is that in 1976, even though none of them knew each other, Stephen Morris, Ian Curtis, and Marky Smith all used to buy weird fiction from the countercultural bookshop The House on the Borderlands, named after a weird fiction story by William Hope Hodgson. I think that's more what they're about. So maybe it's time that good musicians everywhere looked at reclaiming the original idea of the weird, because if they don't, well, you never know who might. And I'm going to skip this next bit and go straight to the end, but if anyone wants to ask me later what I mean about why people on the left need to reclaim the idea of the weird and why it's really important, please do come and talk to me. And in a nutshell, the reason is because people on the right have been doing this for years, and like we don't have enough time over the full weekend to go through the number of neo-folk, black metal, and noise bands who are becoming infected, and once apolitical people who are becoming virulently right-wing xenophobic bigots. Like, so these conversations have already occurred on the right, and it's kind of time that they happen on the left as well. And, you know, I'm talking didactically about left and right, but I feel like we're in times where saying, oh, I'm apolitical is a fucking bad political statement on its own. You know, it's really time for people like us to choose a fucking side, really. Now, where does that bring us with the word weird in 2020? What do we mean? What do we actually mean when we call art or music weird? So Mark Fisher, writing in his final and really brilliant collection of essays, The Weird and the Eerie, in 2017, said both of these effects share a fascination for what lies beyond the standard experience. The weird concerns itself with that which does not belong, and the most common way it is expressed in art or music is by yoking two things that shouldn't be together into violent union. So weirdness finds a natural home in things like surrealist film, photo montage, musique concrète, kind of like electronic cut-up music as well, I guess. But when considering the idea of the weird, Fisher also asked us to hone in on examples that are not horrifying or shocking, but just simply new. Modernist and experimental art and music often strike us as weird when we first encounter it. The conviction that this does not belong is often a sign that we're in the presence of the new. The weird here is a signal that the concepts and frameworks that we have previously employed are now obsolete. If the encounter with the strange here is not straightforwardly pleasurable, because the pleasurable would always refer to a previous form of satisfaction, it is not simply unpleasant either. There is an enjoyment in seeing the familiar and the conventional becoming outmoded, an enjoyment which, in its mixture of pleasure and pain, has something in common with what Lacan calls jouissance. So weirdness in art, in short, is a sign of health and vibrancy. And I myself feel that when we experience weirdness in new culture, it means that once again, new culture is doing exactly what it should be doing. Thanks. I drank too much coffee this afternoon. My heart's really going for it. But I think I've got enough. Does anyone have a question? I mean, like I said, seriously, feel free to ask me about this later on. How are we doing for time? I think we've got another 5 minutes. Is there anyone? Or? Okay, so specifically, this doesn't apply. I was being a bit soapboxy and banging the lectern. It doesn't apply to like everyone, but I think in certain forms of music, people should be aware of this. It doesn't apply, as far as I know, to PC music or let's say like kind of Britpop revivalism or whatever. But I'm taking it that probably people in this room aren't into stuff like that. But if people follow things like neo-folk or folk revival music in general, actually, because it's deeply tied into ideas of national consciousness, but also noise music, industrial music, any kind of traditionalist leaning metal. So that's not just black metal, which takes an unfair amount of the stick, but stuff like Viking metal as well. Like all of this stuff, like I feel personally, it's just my opinion, that you're dealing with what are now dangerous concepts. They might not have been that dangerous, like say in the early 90s or the mid 80s, but they certainly are now. And I think a lot of musicians opt for what I see is like a get out of jail free card, which is by saying, hey man, I'm not about politics. I'm just about the art. And if you're saying that while you're wearing a T-shirt with something that looks suspiciously like a swastika on it, and you're singing about very bleak kind of totalitarian themes, and you know you've got like song titles that sort of refer to, let's say, nativist or right-wing philosophy, then you should no longer be allowed that, oh, it's just my art, man, anymore, because it doesn't fucking wash, I don't think, you know what I mean? It's in 2020, you've just got to look what's going on outside and say, like, enough's enough, you know? And, like, you know, like asking, no one's talking about banning music, but I think asking artists to explain themselves is now, and always has been, totally fucking fine, you know? I don't know if that answers your question or not. A bit of a down note to end on, wasn't it? Is anyone else? The real get out of jail free card with Screwdriver, it's like it really falls apart under any close scrutiny. If like Damien from Pink Eyes wrote this like incredibly persuasive but ultimately bullshit feature about why he loves Screwdriver, and it's just like, look, it's fine for you to be like a Canadian middle class person from the other side of the world who was born after the fact, and you're turning around and saying, well, the first album isn't overtly political, but as far as, like, if you look into it, like, most of Screwdriver were right-wing right from the beginning. It doesn't matter that the first album wasn't. Like, you should look at the band in total and what they were used as, like a spearhead for, really, in this country, you know? I mean, I don't know. Like it raises all sorts of like different questions. I know you, Lisa. We've all been to see loads of bands that have probably done dodgy stuff in the past, haven't we? You know what I mean? I've been to see Mayhem. I'm not throwing stones at anyone or anything like that. But I'm saying, like, in 2020, like the worse things get, the more I'm aware that like stuff needs to be said about this, and we just need to be clear about where certain bands are coming from. You know. No, I've never had a Screwdriver album, ever, you know. Oh, sure, yeah, but I just like, I do think there's something special about the last, 4 or 5 years we've been through, which is like gone from being a thing that, yeah, you should always be aware of this stuff, to being, it's really fucking imperative now that you're aware of this stuff, you know. And also, like, just because, you know, like, stop seeing this shit as a tradition. Fielding on from Otto did an amazing post on Facebook about about the idea of Throbbing Gristle. Like, Throbbing Gristle were doing something very exciting and revolutionary in 1981. They did it. You don't need to do it. They've already done it. You know what I mean? Get your own fucking ideas. You know. Stop seeing it as like a fucking career path. It's not. It's like fucking Throbbing Gristle. It's not a career path, you know. Anyone else? No about fascism, right? You're going. Oh, thank you. Cheers. All right. I'm afraid of everything, mate. I'm less afraid of stuff like this getting commodified than any other sort of music I'm into, because it is allergic to commodification. So if you get a band who's, take Natalie Sharp tonight. Like, if you haven't seen like Body Vice, it's just one of the most brilliant kind of things ever. And you can see that, like, I'm supposed to earn my living as a writer, and I'm kind of dumbfounded when I try and explain what it is that Natalie does. You'll go and watch it, and you'll be like, what the fuck is this? It's like being inside an MRI machine, on drugs, at a footstep rave, in some sort of Yoko Ono having a nervous breakdown. What? I don't, like, Lee Bowery's come back to life. What's going on? It's mad. how do you commodify something like that if you can't even explain what it is? And also, it's like, there's stuff about this current crop of music is that it exists in a zone which is so far out and so lacking in money that a lot of it doesn't get recorded. So once Bodyvice is gone, it's gone, and what will there be? Just like a few snippets on YouTube, you know what I mean? So it's very much like encouraging you to go out and see it. There's never going to be a Bodyvice record. I mean, what would that be anyway? It wouldn't make any sense without you actually going to see it. So yeah, I mean, you've always got to be aware of this stuff, and it'd be horrible, wouldn't it, if like, I don't think like anything we're talking about here is ever going to go, well, having said that, you know, it was like, it's hard to say, isn't it? Before I did the Radio 4 thing, I would have been stood here saying, oh, well, it's only really the people in this room who kind of know about it, or the people who go to that festival, or the people who go to that venue, or the people who read that really cool blog or whatever. But then half a year later, I was on Radio 4 talking to 10 million people about Gutter Snipe, and my mum was phoning me up in tears going, John, what's this awful music? Your dad won't speak to me. Why are you making us listen to it? And so, like, you know, who knows? I mean, really, there is ways that this music and this culture seeps out into the mainstream. But how do you put it to the purpose of selling frozen chips? I don't think you can, you know. I don't think so, anyway. Wicked, all right, thanks very much.